The agenda has explored why so few women are pundits in the media, and tonight we're turning our attention to the changing face of Ontario, how we can go about better reflecting that diversity on our program. So, joining us now with more on that, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, via Skype, Ruben Gastambide Fernandez, Associate Professor at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And with us here in studio, Tina Eden, former lead at Diverse City Voices at the Maytree Foundation. Sarita Shrivastava, Associate Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at Queen's University. Hamlin Grange, President of DiversaPro Inc., and Susan Eng, Vice President for Advocacy at CARP. And it's good to have, Susan, you back here, and you, Hamlin, who haven't been here in a while.
That's right.
But you did shows in this studio, or at least in this building anyway.
Yeah, I'm getting sort of hives.
And Sarita and Tina, first time for you here, so good to have you here.
Thank you.
And Ruben, on the line from way down south, we're glad you could make some time for us tonight as well.
My pleasure.
Let's set this up. Back in November, we were covering the American presidential election. And the day after the election, we got phone calls, and I think this was one voicemail in particular, who said, how come after big political events you guys always trot out the same middle-aged white men? And it got us thinking, how come we have so much difficulty getting female voices on the program, as does everybody, frankly, in media. And then we thought, well, it's not just that that's a problem, it's also getting guests who reflect the new diversity of our province. And that's difficult as well. So we've done some number crunching, and here are some of the numbers for our program. This is percentage of programs that we've done here on the agenda with at least one visible minority guest. And our fiscal year in 2013 isn't done yet, which may explain why the last number is a little low. Fiscal ends, I guess, end of March. But here we go. In fiscal year 2010, 66%, 2011, 60%, 2012, again, we're around two-thirds, and this year a little better than half, and obviously hope to be more reflective as the year goes on. One more set of graphics, if we can, here before we go on. Non-white faces in the media in general. If we look at broadcast hosts and reporters, number analyzed, 286, which is a percentage of visible minorities, just over 20%. Print columnists, 471, percentage that were visible minority, not even 4. Experts or pundits in broadcast, they looked at 343, just over 16%. Stories about everyday life, 200 analyzed, 23% visible minority. Photos in print, more than 2,000, again, less than a quarter, though, visible minority, for a total of, you can see, no more than 3,000, less than 20%. Okay, Tina, these are your numbers, right?
These are numbers that were compiled by Ryerson's Diversity Institute for the Diverse City Project.
How'd you come up
yes.
with all these numbers? Let's start there.
Okay, so the Diversity Institute looked at a snapshot of media. They looked at broadcast and print media over the course of a week. And they were looking at two things in particular. They were looking at who the leaders are in the media, so who's making decisions about what's news. And then they were looking at representation. They were looking at who's reflected in the media. So what they found was interesting. The numbers that they saw reflected what we knew intuitively, what we knew anecdotally.
So no surprises for you there.
No surprises. But what is surprising to me is that in a city, these are statistics that reflect the Greater Toronto Area, and when you have a population where almost 50% of residents are visible minorities, to see that only 20% are being reflected on television and in print, that's very surprising, and to me that's a missed opportunity.
Well, print columnists, less than 4% of print columnists? You find that disturbing?
Well, I think that we need to, the media plays such a uniquely influential role in terms of showing us who our leaders are, who our experts are. They can, shape stereotypes, and they can also, shape the aspirations of young people. So I really think it's important that they're, as an institution, reflecting our values, that they're reflective of the population.
Ruben, let me go to you in Puerto Rico. Are there anything about those numbers that jumps out at you?
Not particularly, actually. I would be curious to know. I know in the US, for example, there have been some analyses of the content of those stories. So, for example, it's pretty well established that the majority of the stories that feature, for example, in the news, that feature people of color are often stories about violence. So of course, it's not simply that people of color are not adequately represented, but it's also that the image that is construed through the media about particular groups oftentimes is negative. So it's not simply a question of numbers, and again, I don't think numbers are surprising. It's also a question of what is the nature of what's being represented through those stories? What is the nature of the kinds of images that are being put forward in those stories? So that would also be really interesting to kind of get a sense for.
Now, Hamlin, that's a good point. There's no point in having a lot more black faces on television if they're always being let off in handcuffs somewhere, is there?
No, not at all.
That's not helping.
Yeah, I mean, what's your reaction to those numbers when you see those numbers as a host of a major television program like this? What's your reaction?
You think
to those
we're a major
numbers?
television program, eh?
Sure.
I'm delighted to hear you say
You
that.
are. What's your reaction to them?
Well,
I'm
the one
curious.
number that jumps out at you, because it's so much lower than everybody else's, is the number of print columnists. 3.4% of the print columnists in the Greater Toronto Area are from visible minority groups. I mean, in a city that is attempting to serve where half the people are of a visible minority background, that seems awfully low.
Awfully low. Yeah. Well,
Am I wrong to infer that?
Oh, of course not. I mean, I'm not surprised at these numbers, and these numbers were compiled. This was back in what?
2010.
2010. Okay. Back in the year 2000, my organization did a similar research, looking at some of the major networks, whether it was CTV, CBC, City TV, a number of them. Same reaction. We did the same analysis of news programs out of Buffalo, New York. Same kind of analysis. It speaks then to me, it says to me that there is a fundamental problem with the way we do news gathering in this industry. So it's not just a Toronto problem, it is a problem right across North America in terms of how we gather news, who gets to be in front of the camera, and has a great impact on who's behind the camera, because somebody behind the camera must make a decision as to what stories we cover. And depending on the stories you cover, you'll decide as to who will be in that story. So it's not just a question of the numbers anymore, Steve. It's about the fundamental way we gather news and information programming in this industry right across North America.
I haven't got first reactions yet from Sarita or Susan, so let's do that. Sarita?
Well, I'm just interested in that very low print media number, and I haven't done research on it, so I can't say why. But to me, it makes you wonder if it doesn't reflect a problem with the way we think about diversity, because often the approaches to diversity are aimed at a public relations exercise. So, in a sense, the visual face, the superficial is what's important. And in print media, that benefit, that gain isn't always there in the same way that it might be in putting a host on a face of.
I'm going to challenge on that, because if you're a print columnist, your picture's on your column.
I think I don't know. That's to say I don't know, but I think to me that's what it speaks. Partly what it speaks to is that approaches to diversity are often about appearances, and I think television is much more appearance visually oriented than print media. So that may be something. I don't know. I'm speculating.
No, that's a fair comment.
As I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, so that would be something. If someone wants to research this, that's what I would be asking about: is where are the decisions made, how are they made about how to become more diverse? And is it about things like how do we look? Is it about how do we gain greater viewership? Because if we put someone in front of the camera, a host who's a person of color, then that will be an easy way to signal diversity. And that's, I think, indicates a fundamental problem with the way that we think about diversity. So that's, to me, a broader conversation, which is...
We'll get to the broader conversation.
Yeah.
But Susan, let me give you your first kick at this.
When I hear those numbers again, I'm extremely annoyed, because the first time I met Hamlin Grange was 30-odd years ago at a conference where we were talking about increasing the diversity of the faces and voices on Canada's broadcast system. So it's very annoying to see that 30 years later, nothing much has changed.
Well, is that true? Nothing much has changed?
Well, maybe the numbers were much smaller then. Yeah. Maybe we're completely invisible at that time. But here we are now, and we're still talking about it. And why is it still important? Well, let's look at why it was important then and now. The media in Canada has its obligation to reflect Canadians back to themselves. Right? And how do we know that the mediation of the media is accurate if it doesn't use a prism that recognizes all of our different and diverse views? Without that kind of diversity and the obligation to actually better reflect all of our diversity, then you will make all of those mistakes that represent certain colors of people in certain kinds of character assassinations, I would say, and never include them as simply the doctor at the table. Now, TVO happens to be one of those broadcasters that makes a real effort to have last session Dr. Samir Sinha, who is a person of South Asian descent, acting as a doctor, not as a South Asian. And that's what we have to see much more. We should stop having to talk about this, but it's unfortunate that we still are.
We brought him on because he's one of the foremost gerontologists in the country.
So. Exactly
Obviously,
so.
He happens to be South Asian, but that's not why he was brought on.
That's the important thing. And with the 4% that you talked about in print journalism, it was the print columnists.
Yes.
Not just the
reporters,
general
columnists.
reporters. Columnists hold an extremely valuable, influential, and expensive part of the news organizations. So while the news organizations try to talk about being, all things, all people, and we value diversity, they actually spend the money on, a select group of people. So that has to change.
Okay, Rubain, let me bring you in on this, because obviously when our producers are trying to book a program, trying to get guests on a program, we tend, just because of the subject nature of this program, to be fishing in lakes for guests. And the lakes are academia, journalism, politics, economics, financial. And as you think about those, the social studies, as you think about those fields, most of the guests, or let me keep the metaphor going, most of the fish swimming in those lakes are white men, which makes it obviously more challenging to get people who aren't white men to come on. And I wonder if, based on your experience, you could tell us how much change there has been in the diversity of the people in academia where you come from.
Well, unfortunately, I would say that the academics don't have a better track record than the media in terms of diversity. I mean, I think even in the context of a place like Boise, which has a reputation for being extremely proactive with regards to things like race and social justice, the department that I'm in, I am one of two out of, I believe, something over 50 some faculty members in our department, and there's only two of us who belong to a minority group. There are other departments that have a better track record. It usually is departments that have more of a sort of very explicit commitment to certain issues around social justice, and so they tend to attract faculty who have those commitments, and who often happen to be faculty who have those commitments because they've experienced it in their own flesh, and so they have those academic commitments. But I think in general, unfortunately, academia reflects very much a very similar pattern. There's a lot of work to be done. There are some people who have some very good commitments around that. It's very difficult, and I would say actually, to go back to kind of the premise of your question as it relates to the work of your producers, in academia we have a very similar way of framing this issue as if it's a question of competing interests. It's the competition between diversity versus quality. We want diversity, but we also want quality. I think it's really problematic to frame the question of diversity that way, because for one thing, it individualizes both of those things as if diversity was an issue of a person. I am diverse. Well, I'm not diverse, right? I am only a member of a group of diverse people, but I am myself not diverse, right? Diversity is not a quality of an individual. And I think also the problem with that framing is that it frames quality also as if it's something that is located in the individual, that only individuals have quality. And unfortunately, the criteria for quality is often comes from those who are the most abundant and who have the most power within particular frames. So that then, people who come from minority backgrounds and who identify themselves with minority groups have to, in a sense, compete against a criteria that they themselves did not create, right? So in a sense, framing the issue, which happens both in the media as in the academia, as a matter of this competing interest of diversity versus quality is really the wrong way of framing it, because it assumes that quality is white men. White men are by definition quality, and so everybody else has to measure to that quality, right? And by those terms. And it assumes also that those of us who are non-white then are there because we represent diversity, not because we represent quality, right? So this generates a whole slew of problems.
Okay, Rubain, then what would the stereotype be about a guy who's not a white man and who's got an earring in each ear?
Well, I can imagine all kinds of stereotypes are operating in people's minds when they see that, and I wouldn't venture to guess what they are.
Okay, let me follow up here then with Sarita, because you're in academics as well. You're at Queen's University. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to guess that Queen's University is not drowning in diversity when it comes to who's on the academic staff. Is that fair to say?
I think there have been some concerted efforts, but
As there are everywhere.
Yes.
But
yes, there are certainly strides to be made. But I'm going to try and shift the conversation a little bit, because like Ruben, I'm concerned about when the conversation stays in this realm of counting bodies. There's a lot of limitations to that. One thing is, because then when we do have enough numbers, what is enough? How many bodies is enough? If there's this many bodies, this percentage, is that then therefore does that indicate some kind of transformation in what Queen's is, what they teach, what their goals are?
Well, can I throw it back at you? Let me throw it back at you.
Yes.
If I don't know what the percentage is in the province of Ontario. I should have it off the top of my head, but I don't. Visible minorities in the province of Ontario, would it be 14%? Is it something like that? I know Toronto it's 50, but across the whole province?
No, it's about 18, almost 20%.
Okay, so does that mean 1 in every 5 guests that we have in this program should be a visible minority? Is that what that means?
No, not necessarily.
No?
Not necessarily.
If we want to be reflective of the audience we serve, does 1 out of every 5 guests...
Is that the goal? To be simply, reflective, like a mirror of, visual qualities, or
what other metric do you want to use?
Well, you can start with
How about diversity of debate?
Right now you have an absence of diverse voices. That is the general comment about the broadcast
Visually,
media.
you mean?
Visually, which is really the way we absorb this information. And so right now we have a virtual absence and a very small minority. So you could start with increasing the numbers. And presumably every time you choose somebody of great quality. But one of the issues of equality is that you're able to be just as mediocre as the next person. Why do you have to be a credit to your race? You can be just another guest. Right? So I think that we want to get ourselves to that point where you see a fair representation of our population having these opinions. And in fact, when we talk about young people, we want people to see themselves in the present and the past so that they believe that they will be part of Canada's future. I mean, this is why it's important, why we're obsessing about this. And we start first with increasing the numbers.
But Sarita is going beyond, you're trying to make a different point.
I think what I'm concerned about is this one tool in a bigger toolkit, or is it a substitute for substantial change? And I think we have to ask that question everywhere, not just in the media, in the university, in our schools, everywhere. And even if it's a tool, counting bodies or quotas or hiring practices, it's an imperfect tool. And that I think we have to acknowledge. And not only that sometimes it really is used as a substitute for profound change. It's a convenient tool. It's easy.
What's a
count
better
bodies.
tool?
Let's have a plan, a broader plan, and a plan that's specific to the institution. So TVO is a very particular institution. It's public television. It's different than a commercial station. It has a latitude to do different kinds of things. It has different kinds of issues that it is interested in, and
it's a more citizenship-oriented mandate than just a private
television. So you
television.
need a plan that's specific to those goals.
But what does that mean?
So I don't know, because I Googled equity and TVO and I came up with a financial plan. So I don't know. I'd be curious.
Okay,
let me go with you on this, Steve, because I mean this is sort of the questions I get to from organizations that I work with, and you can get locked into talking about diversity and not knowing what exactly you're talking about, okay? So first of all, we need to sort of come up with what we mean when we say diversity, okay? Are we talking about people of color? Are we talking about women? Are we talking about people with disabilities? Are we talking about people who are of a particular level of education? Are we talking about regional diversity?
Indigenous?
Indigenous, exactly.
That's another one.
Are we talking about regional diversity? So diversity, really, at the end of the day, is really the mix. It's the mix.
But Hamlin, you know what people mean, though.
No, hold on. It's the mix of all the differences in our population. And you as an organization, whether it's TVO, whether it's Canadian Tire, whether it's RBC, whether it's CMA, whatever it is, okay? You have to decide what diversity you need to reflect in order to meet your own organizational goals.
But diversity is code for non-white. Let's just
It
tell it
is.
like it is.
No, hold on. No.
That is
No,
absolutely
see,
But it's
that
how
is-
it's
no, no,
used.
no.
It's how it's used. And the
And it
reason
shouldn't be
it's used
used.
No,
That's-
that is today's panel. Today's
see,
panel
that's the
was,
danger.
was,
It is a
was
danger. The
changing the
reason-
color balance. And in fact, we just changed your color balance for the year by being
Yeah,
here.
exactly. It's a good thing
And
the financial
at this
year's not
point-
over.
and that is the danger with Sarita's concerned about numbers. If we counted this panel, it would skew the results for the year because we just improved all of your metrics. So does that do it? And what is more, do we discount the fact that we're here talking about color? You know, if we were here talking about something else altogether, then it would count.
So we don't get full marks for this broadcast
Well-
but if you were on talking about, say, auto insurance premiums, that
For
would be
example,
that would be different.
That would be a thing. So
That would be better,
I guess
actually.
that's why we do have to talk about why you have people there. But I think until we get to the point where we stop talking about it, we first of all have to increase the numbers. And when people are there sitting at the table, their history and their perspectives will come to light, will shape the conversation, will shape the
Okay,
priorities.
Tina, we haven't heard from you.
I do think it's really important to count because when you count, you shine the light on an issue and then there's an opportunity to act. But I agree, I don't think counting is the only way. I think it has to be an integrated approach. So when we're looking at organizations, whether it's the media or educational institutions, there has to be some kind of strategic approach. And you know, starting with a business case for diversity. We're not talking about diversity because it's a nice thing to do. There's a really strong bottom line reason why we need to be more diverse as institutions. So with starting from that base, looking at the leadership of the organization, who's making the decisions at the top. And you know, I think of the financial services industry, for example, when you have Ed Clark and Gord Nixon making diversity a strategic priority throughout the organization.
You know what, Tina? It's different in television because the people at the top actually don't make the decisions on who appears on camera.
Who makes the decision?
But
Producers
there are-
make the decisions.
Yes.
So let me ask you this
But
then, Steve.
sorry,
Okay,
I'm
go ahead.
just
Go
going to
ahead.
finish my thought.
Okay.
There are so many different points of intervention. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about the boards of directors, but within media, we're also talking about senior producers, for example. And you know, I think about the person who's an editor. They're making as much of they're part of this conversation as much as anyone else is. So I think we all have a role to play.
That's right.
Okay. Helen.
Okay, the question here is, okay, Steve, you're the host of this program. How much decision do you have in terms of who comes on this program, who sits around this table?
The answer to that question is the programs I produce,
Yeah.
I decide who the guests are. The programs that the producers produce, they decide who the guests are. And it will be a rare cold day in July when I or the executive producer would exercise our so-called authority and come in and say, I think that's the wrong guest, get somebody else. You might want to think about somebody else. That is extremely, listen, unless I'm completely off base, and maybe you ought to have the producers out here and ask them
I
that
think
question.
you should have, actually.
But well,
That's
we did that
exactly-
actually
yeah.
at one point. We actually
Okay.
did that. We're going to show a clip of that a little bit later.
Okay. Well,
the only
But I
reason
think
why
that's the
because-
case.
The only reason why
No.
I
I don't know. I should ask Mary. Mary, you're the producer of this program. You're in my ear right now. Am I wrong? She says I'm right, but what else is she going to say? But she does say I'm right.
The reason why I asked the question to Steve, okay, it comes down to intent, okay, and you have to be intentional about this. When I was hosting the program, when I hosted my programs on the CBC, when I hosted a program called More to the Story, when I did Work Week, for example, for TVO, and I did it was also for CBC at the time as well. Whatever program I've got, I had a choice, and I would say to the producers, and all my producers were white. They were all white. Okay? And I would say to them after a while, you know what? Could you mix up my guests, please? Okay, I'm sure if we're talking about the labor movement, for example, there are a lot of people of color in the labor movement. Why is it I'm always talking to the same people from the same unions? They all look the same.
Because they're in the Rolodex already.
They're in the Rolodex.
We know
Change
them.
up the Rolodex. Get out of your comfort zone. You talked about fishing in particular ponds. Let's use a metaphor. Okay, maybe keep fishing in those ponds, Steve. But if you want to get different fish, you may have to go someplace else, okay? And it means you have to be very deliberate about it, and you have to decide as an organization, as a media organization, whether it's as a program like this or an entire network, what are you trying to solve? And the challenge is, if you want more women, what's women make up 51% of the population or more? Can you say in TV Ontario for this program that 51% of your guests are women? Can you say that?
We can't, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because 80% of the politicians are men.
Exactly.
90% of the economists are men. 95% of people who have expertise in international affairs are men.
Yeah.
So to try to get 50% of our
Exactly.
guests from those ponds
Exactly.
being
Like
women,
women.
Exactly. You can't do it. Exactly. So the
Pretty
same
tough.
thing. Exactly. So you can't. So certainly, I would not necessarily expect a program like this to have 20% or 18% of their guests to be people of
but I'll tell you
color
what,
necessarily.
Hamlin, we strive for it. We
Okay.
fail, but we
Let's go
strive.
beyond the
Sorry.
Rolodex. I think that's really what I'm been, to go back to that point, is that's only a piece of it. Yes, you can diversify the Rolodex. Nobody's using Rolodex anymore anyway. You can diversify
It's a metaphor.
You can diversify the contacts in your iPhone, but that's only a piece of it. And that's really all. I'd be really curious to talk to the producer of the show, because she's going to say, really, all I have time to do is to go to my existing contacts. I could mix up my contacts a bit, but is there a space for the producers to actually sit down and think about the kinds of stories that are being covered, how to diversify the language of the stories, how to change the kinds of questions that are being asked, how the issues are being framed?
Can I follow up with this?
Yes.
Producers often find guests because they read a lot. They're doing research, they're reading magazine articles, they're reading stuff on the web, and they'll see somebody's name associated with a story, and they're interested in the story, and therefore they might try to book that guest. They've never seen that guest before.
That's true.
Is it appropriate to ask that guest what their ethnic background is, or whether they are from a racialized community, if I can put it that way? Is that appropriate to do?
Is it relevant to the story?
Yep. Well,
I don't know.
If it's not, I don't know. I don't.
I would go
You
as
say
far as
yes?
yes, I
Because
would.
I think
would
it's.
say it is.
I think it's instrumental. I think it's
Yes,
only
it's
asked
around-
because
It's part
it's
of the strategy.
instrumental.
You know
No,
what,
because it's
dancing
only
around
because
it.
then it's to fulfill a strategy. It's to fulfill the strategy of the show to increase the numbers. It's not if it's there to actually forward an anti-racist agenda, for example, or an agenda of equity agenda. But how is that? How does it fulfill that
Well,
agenda?
actually,
So you
know
say
what?
you
know
say
what?
don't ask.
I'm thinking about. No, I think you do ask.
You do ask.
And I think here's the thing. We stop for a minute and let's figure out. I keep looking at Hamlin and thinking 30 years, right? And so all of the strategies, everybody came up with strategies. We came up with a casting call. We came up with a database of people of color who could go on commercials. I remember that. We did all of these things to help producers and others dip into different ponds, right? Well, it didn't work entirely. Some people got some airtime, FaceTime, but it didn't work entirely. Why? Because they weren't forced to. At some point, after 30 years, I'm thinking, maybe I don't try to figure it out. I let the industry itself figure out how to respond to consumer demand. And you did a terrific thing in responding to your viewers' criticism, and you were responsive. Many other broadcasters would not be. So maybe what we have to keep doing is have people write into all the broadcast media and say, you know what, not only are we not going to watch your show, we're not going to tell other people not to, we're going to write to the CRTC, we will not buy things from your sponsors, and get to the point where we're saying to people, we're not taking this anymore, you figure out how to fix it.
Ruben, how would you help us fix this?
Well, I listened to the conversation you had with your producers, which I thought was really quite fascinating, and I would not want to be in their shoes. I mean, they are obviously working under a tremendous amount of pressure to put together these shows in a very short amount of time. But one thing that really stood out to me from the conversation that kind of connects back to this question about, how do we change the conversation about diversity, was the way that they all seemed to, they had a shared way of talking about expertise and about what a quote unquote good guest looked like, right? And some of it has to do with credentials, obviously. Some of it has to do with identifying, people's titles and what they produce, what they've written about. But I also heard them speak to a kind of unspoken sort of having a good connection over the phone, right? Again, they have to make decisions really quickly. And I wonder, to what extent does the archetype of the good panelist for TVO, which is probably already premised on the norm of what it means to be a good pundit, is sort of operating in the background, right? And again, this is not meant necessarily as a criticism, but just as an observation of sort of what is the criteria that gets to play when someone is making the decision, a very quick decision, to book someone for a show that has to record in 2 days, right? Again, I don't really want to be in those shoes, but I think thinking about, so what is it that told me this person will be good enough? And could there be a way of kind of thinking about that connection differently, so that it's easier to recognize the quality that potential panelists of color might bring, that might just sound different on the phone than your kind of senior professor white guy from the Department of Linguistics, whatever it is.
Well, you know, I do want to follow up on that issue that came up a moment ago, because I would have a hard time as somebody who was trying to book a program saying to a guest on the phone after I got to the end of the pre-interview, wow, I'm checking off all my boxes. You know the subject, you're a good communicator, you sound like you know what you're talking about. To go that extra step and say, excuse me, but are you a visible minority? Because that would be even better. I can check off another box if you're a visible minority. I got to tell you, that's pretty tough.
It's the way you ask it,
Over time,
Steve.
you
No,
have
no,
to do
it's-
this.
no, it's the way
Over
you ask
time.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can
it's
do this
the way
over
you
time.
ask it.
We're not saying at that moment you do a quota check. What you do is you bring the guest on, you observe the fact, hey, this is somebody I'll keep in mind for another time or not, and you just over time, pay attention to that kind of thing. However, I can tell you that producers have said to me before, we've already have 3 women on the panel, so we're going to not have you, we're going to have the
Come
next
on.
person. I have had that. So it's not as if it can't be done.
That's
The point
ridiculous.
is-
we would never unbook somebody because we already had 3 men.
Well,
Why would you
know
unbook
what?
somebody if you had
Here's
3
the-
women?
There you
Well,
go.
sometimes it happens.
Well, that's the
The
reality,
thing
Steve.
is, the point is, it's in their power to do. So you can also do the positive, and I think we're getting to the point in our lives together that when people get asked that question, they understand and accept your mandate to try to increase the diversity, they probably won't be offended. So there are many ways in which you can handle this over time if we all accept that that is a goal that we want to reach.
Should we, Tina, we've heard this from viewers in the past. They say if you want to get guests on your program who are more reflective of Ontario today, start doing more topics that are, in which you won't have to fish in those same old ponds. You can fish in some other ponds, which, for lack of a better expression, let's just say they're more multicultural ponds. Should we do that?
I think that when you start to build a network and start bringing on guests who are more reflective of the population, that conversation will change. So, and I just want to go back to something Susan said. I was asked by a producer on the show, coming on this show, what my ethnic background was. She couldn't tell from my name. And
For this program
for
today?
this program today, yes. And I have to say, I was not in the slightest bit offended, because the topic of the show, it was very relevant. But before she asked the question, we had a long conversation about what the topic would be, what would be covered, and that was almost an afterthought. So it's not an uncommon question.
I think if somebody were doing a phone interview with you, there's nothing in your voice that or indicates what community you're from, right?
And in fact, it makes me an invisible observer into conversations, because people make assumptions about where I'm from and what I look like.
Your name's Tina Eden, which also doesn't trip anything either. So what is your background?
My parents are Guyanese,
Okay,
so I'm of South Asian descent.
gotcha. Okay. What about on that issue about selecting topics that might be more quote-unquote multicultural as a means of getting more diverse faces out there?
What do you mean by topics that are multicultural?
Well, you could certainly cover multiculturalism. There's one.
Well, this panel is a good start, just having this conversation. I have to say, you don't see this kind of panel and this kind of discussion happening in mainstream media very often. So I think just even beginning the debate and this is important. So that is actually, this is an example of exactly that. Let's pick different kinds of conversations, topic conversations. But because I really am still uncomfortable with this thing of let's just increase the numbers. And I'll tell you, there's a very interesting study done in California on an organization, community organization, very well known for being diverse. It's got a reputation for increasing its diversity. 50% of the staff are people of color. It's an LGBT organization. Interestingly, the organization among the staff and among queer people of color still has a reputation of being a white organization. Why? So the study was done shows that one of the reasons it has that reputation is precisely because of its diversity strategy, because it focuses so much on the language of diversity. Which still, so much of the language of multiculturalism, of including other people, that it still leaves whiteness at the center, that it still is, that the norms of the organization still appear as white, and that it's doing that, a lot of that diversity language is there to satisfy funders, for example, to get more funding for the organization. So it works hard to demonstrate that the clients of the organization that it's serving, that the people that it's serving are people of color, that the staff is people of color. But nevertheless, it still has this. So even when we change, it works really hard. Organizations like such as yourself work really hard to change the numbers. If that's all that's being changed,
I hear you.
Or if there
It's
isn't
not
more
enough.
profound change happening about the language that's being used, the practices. One example is that our organization has a diversity day. all that Diversity Day does, to celebrate in its celebration of diversity, is to reinforce that it's a historically white organization that needs to proclaim its diversity, and that diversity is a code word for race because people are uncomfortable to say race.
Yeah. But to your point, Steve, I mean, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Okay, it becomes problematic when the only time you're going to have people of color sitting around this table is when it's an issue that entails or involves people of color.
Right.
That becomes problematic.
Yep.
Okay, and the very fact is that the second time I've been on this program is to talk about issues around this. No one's ever called me to talk to.
Well, but this is your business. So in
hold
fairness,
on.
this is your business.
This is my business, but I also have other expertise, okay? No one's ever called me to ask me about policing, for example, in the city of Toronto. I sat on the Toronto Police Services Board for 6 years. Not a call from TV Ontario.
Well, I think we've had her
Okay?
on that.
She
was on the commission as well.
Let me finish. I sat on the ROM as a trustee for 6 years. Not a call from TV Ontario to ask me about arts, about culture, about anything like that. I got a lot of information about that stuff, Steve. I got a lot of information about that stuff. There are a lot of things that I know that you don't know that I know, but the only way you're going to find out is talking to me, all right? What I'm saying is that producers and journalists in general, I believe, and I'm going to say we, because I still consider myself a journalist, we've become lazy, okay? We go for the easy hits. We go for those folks who we have actually trained to be good guests. We actually train people how to give good clips. We train people how to behave on panels like this because we want a particular thing. Keep it sharp, keep it moving, okay? We actually train people to be on television. And what I'm saying is, keep doing what you're doing, but train a whole bunch of other people. That's all I'm saying. Okay? It's never going to change. And that's the reason why I'm saying 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the same research that diversity found, the results in terms of who gets on TV and who doesn't get on TV, the exact results were there. And it happened, as I said, not just here in Toronto, but it happens around the world, across North America. It's the way we do business as news and information gatherers. We must change that approach. So for me, it's not just about diversity anymore, it's about inclusion. How do we include voices at the table, okay? To live the code and, quite frankly, the core values of journalism. Accuracy, balance, respect, fairness, all of those things. If you're hearing from a single voice all the time, I think we are betraying the very core value of journalism.
We do shoot for balance of opinions, though, not just balance of skin color, if I can put it that way.
There's nothing wrong with that at all. Excellent.
Nothing wrong with that. I mean, is that almost as essential an element
It's
in all of
absolutely
this?
essential.
That's the
Absolutely
essential.
That's the essential
Absolutely
element. Okay.
essential. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
I agree.
What I'd like to hear from the producer is why is it, from the producers who are experiencing this difficulty in gaining guests and diversity of guests, is what is the reason for that? Is it lack of time? Is it the kinds of stories that they're picking? You know, because otherwise there's no way to remedy it. If all you're doing is then when you talk to a guest, say, "Are you a visible minority?" check. If that's not going to fix the issue. Really, what's the problem is how is it that we're, because if there's a certain diversity, yes, you could say, okay, the pools that we're fishing from are not
answer.
diverse, but I don't think that's the only answer.
Well, that's
okay,
a huge part of the answer.
Well, it's not enough. That's not a good enough answer. I think there's something else going on, which is the kinds of people that, how is it that you assess people as experts to talk about what's going on in Ontario? The very structure of an expert panel means that those people you're drawing people from certain kinds of pools that are considered, that are professors and heads of organizations and so on. That's one of the answers. You have to dig a little deeper to look at how is it that we're ending up with certain kinds of people on shows and panels and who are held up as knowledgeable about anything in all. There's other ways of figuring out what's going on in Ontario than talking to the elite. And that's...
Well, I don't know. I don't think of this place as a repository for the elites. I mean, we certainly go beyond that.
But it's part of the problem, right? To say that you're why I don't know the answer. That's why I'm asking these questions. But I think that I'm suspecting, I'm speculating that part of the problem is how it is that people choose who is an expert to talk on particular issues.
Okay, Susan, you want to follow up?
You know what? Because it's been 30 years, and I know I'm obsessing. I can't get it out of my head. Is that people come up with too many explanations, if not excuses, for why it hasn't happened. Part of what's missing in that formula is that they haven't wanted it to happen. So how do we get the people who make those decisions, who look harder, who read wider, more widely, how do we get them to want to make the change? We need them to understand that it's meaningful for those of us of color, our children and our grandchildren, but also to them, if they want, if they really see their role as part of nation building, that they want to reflect the Canadian image that we keep talking about overseas, but have a hard time reflecting in our broadcast media, then maybe we have to reshape what it is they are their goals, and they need to choose to do this. We can't force new attitudes down their throats.
Let me follow up with Tina then on this. This is a program that, for better or worse, has decided that it's going to cover X, Y, and Z, which, again, for better or worse, we have decided are the most important issues in our province at the dawn of the 21st century. And, forgive me, but it's not cooking, and it's not sports, and it's not kind of, 99 days out of 100, it's not going to be the life section of the newspaper as well. It's not show business. It's going to be politics and economics and international affairs and social sciences and science and a lot of that. And it's mostly white men that populate the guest pools of those areas. So what's your suggestion? Do we have to change what we cover?
I think that's an interesting question. As a first response, and I know this came up in the conversation about gender, if you're looking for an economist, for example, and you happen to only be able to find white men who are economists, I think expanding that frame, if you're really invested in diversity, expanding that frame a little bit and maybe considering someone from the business community, that might be another way to approach. So I think that in being more inclusive and bringing more diverse voices around the table, that it's going to challenge media producers to look at the way they frame the shows. And I think that's exciting because that's part of the conversation as well. That's part of representation.
All right, let me ask the second uncomfortable question here, and I'll ask it of you because this is your business. Is it possible that there are so many fewer, quote unquote, diverse guests on all of these subject matters?
Are you talking persons of color?
Yeah. Okay, you're right. I should just say it.
I just want to be clear what you're talking about when you say diversity. That's all.
Good point. Is it true that there are so few non-white economists, international affairs experts, whatever, the places we go for guests, because people from those communities haven't gone into these fields in the numbers that white people have, and therefore it's harder to book them?
Sure. There's the economy of scale, okay? I cannot sit here and give you the numbers in terms of how many non-whites are in the economic field or in the sciences. I know they exist. They're out there because I've met some of them, all right? But I can't give you a number necessarily. It seems to me that you are going to be getting a particular type of individual for these programs, for these subject matters, just because of the very nature of our society, okay? This is still a very white country. Okay, is populated by a lot of white people.
Increasingly less so.
Increasingly less so. There's still a lot of white people. And there's still a lot of people who are white or Caucasians who are in certain sectors or also in certain strata within our society. That's a given, okay? You have to make a decision as an organization, as a news program, whether or not you want to tap into the broadest sense as possible in terms of what Canadians are and what they look like. And then you have to make a decision. You make a decision. Because at the end of the day, it's your show. You can have anybody on this program that you want. You can have somebody who's absolutely brilliant. You can have somebody who's not absolutely brilliant.
Actually, the program we did on Binders Full of Women proved that we can't get whoever we want.
Because that was a different issue.
Because
that was a different issue.
When it came to gender, we wanted to get more women, and we often got turned down for a whole host of reasons.
Exactly, and that was a different issue because it was interesting what your clinical psychologist was talking about. It sort of bordered on sociobiology, to be frank about it, the stuff he was talking about. But at the end of the day, I would be curious to know what sort of research they have done as to why people of color are never available to be on this program. I'd be curious to know about that.
It's different.
Because I don't know. Exactly. Yeah. It's absolutely different.
No man has turned down a guest shot on a program because his roots were showing. No man has turned down a guest shot on a program because he had to take care of the kids in the evening.
Hardly are men asked to talk about being men. In many ways, I've been on many programs where we talk about people of color, and I've been on many programs where I'm talking about what I'm actually doing, right?
Isn't
And
that
so
refreshing, isn't it?
in many ways, I tell a lot of my friends I'm a bit of a secular Chinese, in the sense that, I don't spend all my time being Chinese, right? Of Chinese origin. So I think that that's always unnerves people who otherwise have brilliant professional credentials, but they're asked to come and talk about their identity. The identity part of things, because it was never a hugely positive thing, You get diversity days, but you've had to pay for it. You've had to deal with discrimination. You've had to deal with having to accommodate somebody's unease with who and what you are. So it's unlikely that there'll be people who jump at the chance to come and talk about being whatever color they happen to be. So it might limit your pool. It just means you'll have to try a little bit harder.
Rubain, let me ask this. If we invited, let's say, pick anything out of the hat. If we picked an Indigenous Canadian to come on and talk about the economy for whatever reason, and let's say they didn't do a good job, have we done a disservice to Indigenous Canadians by showing them in front of thousands of people that this particular Indigenous Canadian, couldn't put the puck in the net when it came to talking about economics?
Well, that is a risk that all of us as minorities, I think, often keep in mind, is that when a person of color does something bad, the audience assumes that all people of color are bad. But when a white person does something bad, that's just that one person that did something bad, right? And I think
Double
that never
standard, I
leaves our
agree.
mind. While at the same time, we're deeply conscious of the fact that there's a tremendous amount of diversity within groups, and so it's a bit of a catch-22, right? That we have to contend with when we're invited to participate in these programs. But I think the question again can't just simply be about kind of the optics or the kind of numbers of representation. I think it really is about returning to the question of what is the criteria of selection. So it isn't just about diversity of opinion. I don't think it is just about diversity of expertise. I think it should also be about diversity of experience and about where people are situated in relationship to a problem. If you're talking about economic inequality, and you only have professors talking about economic inequality, the only experience they can talk about is the actual rather privileged experience of being a professor. What about talking to poor people about economic?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was trying to say.
If you want to build a panel that represents a diversity of experiences, I suspect you're going to have a much easier time bringing people from diverse backgrounds, because if you're talking about the environment, and you talk about the people who are most affected by environmental crises, it's going to be people of color.
Lived experience.
That's exactly.
Well, if we were to call you and say, Hamlin, we're doing a program on what it's like to be a member of the Black community in Toronto.
I'd be busy.
I was going to say,
I'd be busy that
you'd be
day.
offended if we made that call.
What I would do is, but I would give you names of 4 other people who probably would be very open to come and talk about
I thought you were going to tell me that's a stupid question because there's no such thing as the Black community in Toronto.
There are communities.
Communities, exactly.
Yeah. There are a multiplicity of communities within.
So doesn't that annoy you when you see that?
Could be a very interesting conversation. In fact, Environics is in the middle of doing a research right now on the Black experience in Canada. It'd be interesting to see what comes up. It could be very interesting.
Okay, but the notion of, you said you could give me 4 other guests. You don't think they'd be ticked off about having to come on and
I don't know.
and represent the Black community in
I don't know,
Toronto?
but I'm going to give you 4 names because I said I'm busy.
But
And then it's going to be your producer who decides whether or not those individuals will meet their particular standards based on pre-interview. Everybody got pre-interviewed before they came here.
Right.
And based on the pre-interview, your producers decide that, hey, that's a pretty good talker. That's a pretty good talker. And that's how you book them. We book talkers for these shows. Okay? You're a good talker. You're on.
But you could have
Not
a
a good talker,
great
no.
show that's called "What Do We Mean by Black Community?"
Right.
Could be a very interesting program.
And especially if you have a guest on that tells us what the white community is thinking.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating.
Now,
Just
would
to
we
have a
get...
Some
guest
white
who's talking
informants.
about how the psychological research shows that Black people are a particular way and white people are a particular way.
Sorry, don't go there.
But here's the question then. Are we going to get props, as the kids say? Are we going to get props for doing a show on the many different faces of the Black communities in the Greater Toronto Area? Or are we going to get accused of trying to pad our so-called diverse guest numbers for the month?
No, it depends on the content.
Depends on the
props.
questions, exactly.
You will get props if you do a program that really explores, okay, the African Canadian experience within Ontario, okay, and how that experience plays itself out in so many different parts of the African Canadian community. Whether it's somebody who lives in I hate to use the phrase Jane and Finch, or someone lives in Rosedale. Okay, a banker versus a baker versus a candlestick maker. The experiences are different. That makes for a very rich conversation. Nobody wants to talk about that because
Actually,
all black people are alike anyway, right? We all
show.
lumped into one.
Mary,
we're all the same. We're not.
We did that show last year, didn't we, Mary?
You did. Yes, you
On
did.
candlestick makers?
Yeah, we did it already.
You know, it's good. No, it was a very good program.
Okay.
Yeah, you cover the waterfront
All
on
right.
that one.
How are we doing on time, Carol? What I got? 3.5 minutes left. Okay, not much time, but okay. Sarita, how do we do this without falling victim to playing the kind of token card, right? That's something none of us wants to do.
No one wants to be the token.
Right.
And in my experience, when I've been a token, it hasn't been successful. When I've been asked to be the token whatever, South Asian or single mother or whatever it happens to be, it never works because I can't produce something that jives with the goals of that particular book or show or whatever. So I don't think it's a fruitful exploration. The only real answer is you need some time to create a broader plan and strategy. You need to think about what kind of vision, first of all, what's our goal? What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve just a different look for our show so that it looks different visually and it reflects visually the diversity or reflects different walks of life? Or are we trying to create a political diversity, a conversation, and actually with the broader goal of not just the bottom line of having more viewership or selling more products because we have great diversity, but actually we have a vision of a different kind of future for the province, for the country. That you don't know until you sit down and have the time. I'm sure your producers don't have that kind of time.
No, they don't. We keep them busy. That's true. Tina, if we have this conversation in 10 years, any of these numbers that we started the program with going to be different?
I hope so.
We all hope so, but
I think what we really need to pay attention to is looking at the big picture. So media have a responsibility in this, but so do other institutions. And one of a project that I created with Maitri is called Diversity Voices, and it was exactly what you're talking about, Susan. It was to address the lack of diversity that we see on television and radio and print. And initially, when we started this database that now has 300 people in it, and from visible minority communities who can talk about issues ranging from neuroscience to grassroots art initiatives to fertility issues. It's such an interesting group of people. Within the first 6 months of the program, I worried that we weren't going to be successful because 9 calls out of 10 that we received from journalists were still requesting, people from specific ethnocultural backgrounds. Can you connect me with a South Asian person who can comment on South Asian Heritage Month? And I was very concerned. But what I saw happen over time, and I hope this is part of the evolution that we're going to see, is that as these networks evolve, and as a fundamental part of networking is building trust. So as that trust starts to happen, that maybe they might bring someone to talk about diversity in the media on the first show, but in having that conversation with someone, maybe they'll find out that they're an expert in seniors issues or they're an economist. And in the next incarnation of their visit on the show, they'll be talking about something related to their area of expertise.
I think Tina's absolutely right.
20 seconds left, Susan.
Yeah, if I'm asked, I still say yes, because I think it's an important job that we have, which is to raise these issues, talk about these issues. And remember, it's an open microphone. I can say whatever I like, so never give up the opportunity. Get out there, represent the different voices, argue the point, and things will change over time.
From your lips to God's ears. Let's put it that way. Thanks, everybody, for coming on the program today. Great discussion. Ruben Gastambide Fernandez, we're so glad you could make some time for us from Oise, on the line from San Juan, Puerto Rico. On the left-hand side of the table, Sarita Shrivastava, Associate Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at Queen's University, Hamlin Grange, President, Diversa Pro. And on the other side of the table, Tina Eden, former lead at Diverse City Voices, and Susan Eng, the Vice President of Advocacy for CARP. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.